let me start with very, very sincere confession. I'm not simply honored to open our 3 days conference, but I'm also profoundly touched, because I have no illusion that I'm here not exclusively and not because of my academic achievements. If that were the case, I'm sure it would be another person here. I think the reason which motivated organizers to propose that honor to talk today to me was very personal, and in fact it was also obvious from the introduction. The reason is my long story of relation with Kumu, with Tallinn, with Estonian colleagues, with Estonian artists. There is an entire story behind it, and it's true, it started in the 90s. It's the reason, I repeat, I'm not simply honored, but I'm also, and first of all, touched. And that also, I hope, allowed me to be very personal in my talk. I'm not pretending to exhaust this extraordinary decade, analytically exhaust in my presentation. I will propose you my view on it, how I live it, and how I live it in a very precise point of the, let's say, post-communist world, because it would be simplification to unify such a complex reality as, in fact, it is post-communist world, just in one definition, just reduce it to one emblematic experience, from Kyrgyzstan to Estonia, from former Yugoslavia to Poland. These are very, very different realities which lift this passage from the past to the future in a very, very different original way. And my last remark before I would enter into my presentation is that this personal dimension, which in fact is behind my invitation, it's something very profoundly rooted exactly in the 90s, in its spirit, in its major message for nowadays, and that is what I'm going to speak now in the course of my presentation. Nowadays, we can notice the return to 90s. 90s for 15 years it was forgotten, I would say. And recently it came back, and this is also very symptomatic and interesting. 90s, it's in the center of debates, reflection, and attempts to define it. In the same time, the definitions which are proposed, which are on the tables, are in reality opposite. There is no unanimous decision what was that period of time. Till nowadays, for many, that was a period of betray. That was a period of suffering, of disorder and of sorrow. And well, there is a lot of reasons to things like that. In the same time, for many, 90s, it's a period of hope. It's a period which gave us a lot of chance. Chance lost or perhaps realized. But what definitely it's seen unanimously everywhere, it's that 90s, it's a decade which it's a unique period of time. It's a time which is drastically different from the previous period of the, let's say, late communist time, and which is also absolutely different from the period which came after it. 90s is seen as something which came from the coherent becoming of the historical process. In fact, this is the reason why nowadays very often those who want to justify our post-90s decades of, let's say, normalization, stabilization, in their attempt to justify it, they're saying, as minimum, it's not so ugly time as it was in the first post-communist decade. The same, it's also with those who wants to defend 90s. Yes, that was a complicated time, but for sure, thanks for the 90s, we came out from the cauchemar of the communist time. And in fact, the most conventional definition of the 90s, it's transitional time, transitional decade. So that it's a time which is in between times. Being a period of transition, being period of in transition, that decade was a period of changes. And in reality, those who lived that decade for sure remember that these changes were catastrophic. The timing was really, really very, very convulsively dynamic. It was a decade very euphoric and in the same time very exhausting. That was a time of permanent change, of permanent projects, absolutely flamboyant projects, and projects absolutely, most of them were absolutely megalomaniac. But what is interesting that, and what we have to consider that in this particular condition of transition, I mean social crisis, economical collapse, tremendous difficulties in all domains. Obviously, most of these megalomaniac projects were destined to fall immediately. I would say that Kumu, it's perhaps one of the very few megalomaniac projects of the 90s, which in reality was terminated and realized. And in reality, all these projects, and this is also something profoundly rooted in the specificity of that decade, they were in reality projects attempt to change something, condition, but without a clear end. That were endless projects and changes without clear end, and because the ends were missing, and the ends were missing because the projects and changes were endless. When I came to this definition, I had it came into my mind the famous book of George Agamben, Means Without End. But then it came into my mind another definition done by, of the 90s in fact, this time, done by a Russian writer, famous Russian writer. In fact, a writer appeared in the 90s, and the writer who, from my point of view, remained in the 90s. The writer who perhaps gave the most coherent, the most precise definition of the 90s, I mean Viktor Pelevin. One of his book done in the 90s was in fact titled, in Russian it's «Диалектика переходного периода из ниоткуда в никуда». Dialectics of the transitional period from nowhere to nowhere. And in fact, it's absolutely coherent, precise definition of that of that historical transitional decade. So it's not only a transitional decade, it's not only time in between times, but also is a period which could be considered as period of timelessness, that is being out of time. I think that that 90s, just in the 90s, were very conscious of the fact that they are out of time. Because 90s, and this is why I wanted so much to have this image on the screen. This is a work of Moscow artist Anatoly Osmolovsky, which has different titles in reality. Artists changed the titles of the work a few times, but the most easiest, the initial title was Osmolovsky on over Mayakovsky. Young Osmolovsky, helped by the crane, installed himself on the shoulder of the great revolutionary poet Vladimir Mayakovsky, his statue in the center of Moscow. So, and this is a work of 1993. So Moscow was, 90s were very conscious of being a revolutionary age. From the very beginning, it was completely clear that this is an age called to life by the historical break. And in fact, it's coming into my mind the famous Carl Schmitt definition, state of an exception. But I have to say that Carl Schmitt was discussed, Carl Schmitt and his idea of the state of the exception was discussed just in the early 90s. I remember that we discussed theoretical legacy of the theoretical heritage of Carl Schmitt in 1992 in Moscow in NSK embassy. We were trying to discuss with Irvin Group from Ljubljana an idea of foundation of the new state in the moment when the state of federal state of Yugoslavia was collapsing. And not by chance that Carl Schmitt and his ideas were just in discussion in the early 90s, because really helped, thanks for his politological concepts, many things became explainable, understandable, definable. So 90s from the very beginning were seen as jump from the history. We're seen as a condition of the permanent present. In fact, in my early text, when I was trying to explain, in fact, also work of Anatoly Osmolovsky, I was insisting that we are living now in the dimension here and now. That we don't have future and we don't have the past. We are in the permanent presence. So if I have to reassume what I have said before, I would say that 90s were the decade of transition, which was endlessly prolonging transitionary phase, avoiding to reach the point of destination, and was a timeless time, permanently enjoying the present moment. But that explains us or help us to understand another quality of the 90s. I mean, transfusion in between politics and art. Of course, it's not the first case in 20th century when art and politics established a very profound alliance. Well, we know the famous Walter Benjamin explanation of the experience before, of similar experience in the first part of the 20th century. But definitely 90s was in some way closed that 20th century alliance in between politics and art, and in a very particular way, absolutely different from what Walter Benjamin was writing in the 30s. Politicians, as it is well known, were claiming that their task is to leave behind communist past and to build up the real democracy and market economy. In the art sphere, art activists, art reformers were sustaining that we have to dismantle state protectionism that typical for the communist past. We have to build a new art system which will guarantee to the creative workers real freedom, and definitely which would be based not anymore on state subsidizes, but on market rules, on market, on the artist market. Of course, it's very typical. It's just a remark aside that in the 90s, freedom, democracy was seen as a condition that. Market was seen as a condition for freedom and democracy. Well, it needed perhaps 20 years after to understand that it was an absolutely false idea. But obviously, to build up a market economy and art market just in 1, 2, 3 years was mostly impossible. The same also with the democracy. In the course of the 90s, well, I'm this time referring to my Russian experience. All 90s, the major rhetorics from the political forces, from all the specters were always repeating. There is not enough democracy. Democracy is in danger. We are risking to have neo-communist, neo-fascist revenge. We are always under the risk to lose the society itself. We need to do a lot to build a real democracy. There is not sufficient democracy, and so on. So, in other words, democracy was claimed, but it was absolutely conscious that this project could not be immediately realized, or it's realized not in a very sufficient way. Well, the same it's also obviously in art, because 90s art scene was really fallen in a total misery. And a real market in, we can also consider that it doesn't exist even now after 30 years of the end of communism. In this way, in reality, fight for democracy and fight for the new art condition became the main occupation of political and artistic in political and in artistic scene. I would say that political life and became very performative. Well, again, let me, as a reference, choose a political scene in Russia in the 90s. What was in this how was acting undiscussable leader of the Russian 90s, I mean Boris Yeltsin. He had no clear political project, but what he always doing, permanently doing, he was, I would use artistic term, he was reenacting the revolutionary gesture of rupture. He was producing crisis, and then in a very brilliant way he was solving this crises. So very similar to Moscow actionists who were practically practicing the same. They were repeatedly were reenacting revolutionary neo-avant-gardist gestures. In the same time, art, if politics became performative, in the same time, art insisted that what do they do in the condition when artism doesn't exist? They're not doing art, they're doing politics. That was a program of so-called Moscow actionism, which was founded by Anatoly Smolovsky, in fact. But what is also, in the same time, very typical for the, and genuinely typical for the political artist in the 90s. They were insisting that they are political artists. They were performing a gesture of political artists. They were performing themselves to be fidel to the idea of revolution. But they had no political program. They had no clear political ends. That they were absolutely unable to explain what exactly they want to realize, what are their political ideas. And I have to say, it would be in a very convulsive and catastrophical situation of the 90s that were practically impossible. And the artists were very conscious of that. And in fact, a term which appeared in the 90s, it was, which was defining strategy of political artists, it was gestures of relation. Artists were absolutely self-reflective, and they were perfectly were understanding their limits. They are political artists without political program. What they were showing, message which they were sending to the society, was just reconfirmation of their will to re-establish the figure of political artist, but without a clear political program. Another quality of the 90s, I guess, was that it was a period of time incredibly rich of different positions, of different projects, of different intentions, of different claims and declarations. January 99, the very beginning of the first post-communist decade, it's really implanted in my memory. In Moscow was organized enormous political manifestation. It was really enormous. I never seen the major one in my city. And what profoundly shocked me, it's a quantity of political slogans, of political groups which were on the street. From the cover of the communist ideology came out on the light the most bizarre, the most strange, the most unexpected political groups. obviously neo-monarchists, but also national Bolsheviks, groups which were sustaining that we have to build Buddhist socialism. I remember them were dressed as a Buddhist monk, but with a political slogan. This incredible variety of political ideas, and variety and the quantity of people which were associating themselves with these strange political ideas were really shocking, surprising. That was an incredible political carnival. I never seen something like that, not before and even after. But the same, I would say, in the 90s, we can notice also in artistic life. Because the lack of the infrastructure, lack of the system of art, impossible in transitional period of time, gave a chance to any group, to any trend, to any tendencies, to any poetics, to consider themselves absolutely reasonable dignities from former social realist artists, from icon painters who thought that with the end of communism now it's arrived their time, to art and science groups. Obviously, art texture in any time, in any place, it's very rich. But the art system usually is establishing a hierarchy. It's fixing the mainstream and marginalities. In the 90s, everything was horizontal, as in political life, as also in artistic life. For sure, in the Russian context, Moscow actionism, perhaps it was the most symptomatic, the most coherent with the gist of the time movement, but it was producing nothing solid. Their activity was absolutely ephemeral. What they were doing was not touchable. They were very complicated to put it on the table as a strong and touchable argument. But in the same time, I would say, behave our national leader also, Boris Yeltsin, also on the political scene. He had no political project himself, but he very generously was giving a chance to any political program to appear, to be present, to be visible, to be shown, but then his political ability was focused on blocking this, blocking political ambitions and wish to get power to all these different political groups. He was manipulating them, he was mediating them, and he was blocking them. That's how political life in Russia lived a period of the first post-communist decade. And what is also curious and also typical, Buddhist socialism, neo-monarchism, national Bolshevism, as also fidelity to avant-garde, fidelity to icon paintings. Practically, in most of the cases, the reference was not the future, but the reference was the past. Artistic proposals and also political proposals were mostly, their deep nature was based on the procedure to repropose the future, the past as the future, but on conditions that it would be never realized. In fact, in the 90s, it appeared the famous the famous slogan of Francis Fukuyama, "End of history." Well, this is, from my point of view, very particular post-communist version of the end of history. History was reproposed as a future without a chance to be realized. But the real dimension for this future-oriented past, or the past-oriented future, was permanent presence. This is why 90s was a decade of exalted potentiality without a chance to be fulfilled. Well, and now I'm coming to the very gist of my presentation today. The politics which was purely performative and was not persuading the ends, and as also art practice which was indifferent to the object of production, in some way recognized itself in theoretical philosophical ideas which in fact appeared at the end of the 80s, in the early 90s. I mean, the famous book of Nancy, inoperative community. I mean, idea of just mentioned Georgia Agamben about inoperativita. This refuse of work, this refuse of concrete production, which in some way give you a possibility to touch the profound, substantial essence of the phenomenon, and which was also, for my, this is also quite important, that that this refuse of operativity and this wish to remain always in the performative dimension created the condition of proximity. And that was inevitable because if we are coming back to the art scene, in a situation of the collapse of the art system, institutional, structural mediation was practically gone. In my text written exactly at the end of 90s, when I've done the first attempt to reassume that period of time in artistic sphere, of course, first of all. In fact, the text was titled provocatively and a little bit bizarre way, "Cultural Contradiction of Tusovka." In fact, Tusovka, it's a personal communication in Bohemian sphere. And in fact, I was explaining how, in reality, all these typical for the 90s megalomaniac projects were practically performed by the certain subjects, by individuals. It was a subject magazine. In fact, that was my mission. It was a subject cultural center, subject art fair. The projects were not destined to realize, but the person who was representing this structural, institutional element in the art system was here. He was on the stage. You can talk to him, you can speak to him, you could touch to him, you can drink with him. And this direct proximity, it's in reality really something incredible, exciting, and unique in this period of time. In fact, my curatorial activity in this period of time And I think this is perhaps my major contribution to the 90s, that as a curator, I realized this particular dimension of the 90s. That 90s give you a chance to do an artistic activity, a curatorial activity in a direct relation with the artist, without mediation. Obviously, just mentioned NSK Embassy in 1992 in Moscow contributed a lot. It was one of the first innovative project of the 90s, and a series of works I realized in the same time, because in fact NSK appeared with its very performative project in Moscow as an answer to my invitation to come to the project of the named Apt Art Int. In the early 90s, I reproposed a project of underground type to do exhibitions in apartment, in artist studio, but I invited international artists to come to Moscow, and not to do large-scale institutional exhibition, but to do something in a private dimension, in a proximity, in a direct physical, emotional contact with, affective contact with the with artist, audience, and art world in general. In fact, at that time I was theoretizing that curatorship is based on friendship. And a friend of mine and brilliant art critic, Ekaterina Dzogats, defined 90s as a theater of envy. Envy, friendship, these are opposite extremes, but which are in some way giving the same, noticing the same in the 90s. That was a time of affectivity. That was a time when professional and existential, emotional and intellectual were profoundly mixed. The major paradox, I would say, of the 90s legacy is that this value of the 90s in reality was not evaluated. Was just at the beginning of the second post-communist decade, when the first signs of the certain prosperity, of the certain solidity, when the first signs of the market or of the institutional, of the becoming of the institutional art scene appeared, the major figure of the 90s immediately jumped into this new context. Just in the 90s, when they were enjoying this permanent presence, and now, by the way, most of my friends are recalling 90s with nostalgia, very sentimentally, but in that period of time, they immediately betrayed 90s. Because in the 90s, it seemed them that this condition of proximity, of affectivity, it's something imposed by circumstances. It has no value in itself. You can't evaluate this value in the new condition. Now you have to become part of the global world. Now you have to become a correct institutional artist. Yes, you can defend critical values, critical discourse. You can quote correct leftist theoreticians. You can do correct critical projects, but you should do it correctly, according to the established art system, respecting rules. And of your romantic and miserable past, well, as usually most of the artists, curators, activists were a little bit ashamed. And in fact, there is paradoxically, even if I would mention, let's say, political activism of the decade zero, and even current political activism, or if to be precise, what's remained from the political activism nowadays, it's absolutely comprehensible why political activists nowadays has no respect for the 90s, because it was time without end. And political activist, if he is really a political activist, or if he's correctly performing political activist, he must have the end. He must be operative, otherwise he is not a political activist at all. But now we are noticing how easily political activism of post-90s was consumed by the system and by a neoliberal methodology of acting in social space, in society, but also in the art field. So I want to believe that this new appeal to the 90s perhaps could finally evaluate its real gist, its real message, its real value, its real legacy. Well, as minimum, this is my wish. Well, thank you.